Welcome. This snowy winter, Mayor Bill de Blasio has taken a lot of flack for failing to close New York City public schools back on February 13th after a major snowstorm. But in his defense, we all know that keeping school open is important for continuity in the classroom. Or is it? We will learn about that when the bell rings in a moment. Also on today's program, driving. Soon we'll all be better at it because our cars will automatically communicate with other cars and the roadway. Sounds like a good use of high tech. But is this supplying preschoolers with electronic books, e-readers for non-readers? And toward the end of the hour together, we will learn how some med students have been lured into improving probably the most used source of medical information in the world, Wikipedia, for better or worse. First, though, today's Public Intellectual segment, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. This week, the public policy question is to close or not close the schools in bad weather. Yes, there's the safety factor and who's going to watch the kids, but educationally, is it important to get in those few extra school days? In Massachusetts, the Board of Education asked a Harvard researcher to assess the impact of school closures on grades. Joining us via Skype, that researcher, Joshua Goodman, professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor, thanks for doing this. Welcome to the Brian Lehrer Show. Hello from New York.
Thanks for having me.
So what research question were you trying to ask precisely?
So the state of Massachusetts was interested in finding out whether the lost instructional time that comes from snow days had an impact on Massachusetts students' end-of-year test scores, their standardized test scores. These test scores matter for schools complying with Massachusetts law and for federal law, for the No Child Left Behind Act.
And how many snow days are we talking about for you even to measure? If Massachusetts is anything like New York, the maximum would just be a handful or less.
That's right. So what I discovered is that over the last decade, the average student in Massachusetts experiences about 2 snow days a year. Some years have none, some years have 4 or 5, but 2 is the average. So we're not talking about a huge number of days.
So you tried to tease out statistically, quantitatively, the impact on end-of-year standardized test scores from 0 versus 1 versus 2 snow days?
Exactly. So what I was trying to measure was how does each day that you lose due to snow and due to the school closing affect your end-of-year test scores?
And so how did you isolate these snow days as a variable?
So that's a great question. Basically, what I did was put together a data set that figured out for every school in Massachusetts what kind of weather that school experienced in every year over the last decade. And so what we were asking in the study is how does the number of extremely snowy days relate to the number of school closures, and how does that in turn relate to student achievement? So what we were doing is comparing a school to itself in snowy years versus itself in not very snowy years.
And you found?
That there was no effect whatsoever of school closures on student achievement.
Therefore, if it's a crummy day and you want people to stay home, let them stay home? So
I think to a degree, yes. I think the key here to think about is that in Massachusetts, I think of this in terms of the fact that I was a high school teacher for a couple of years before I became an academic. And for me, a snow day is a relatively easy thing to deal with as a teacher. All you have to do when your school closes is push your lesson plans back a day, and that's not very disruptive to students. The thing that gets lost, of course, is that you usually have to cut out something fun or optional that wasn't going to be on the test at the end of the year, and that's something we just can't measure in the data. But I think what my findings suggest is that teachers are pretty good about dealing with the school closures themselves.
Here in New York, I believe the law is that there needs to be 180 days in a public school year of actual instruction. And they only have 180 days on the calendar. So if it's a snow day, one day, then they have to make it up by shortening Easter break or something like that. So there winds up being the same number of school days whether there's a snow day along the way or not. Is it different in Massachusetts?
It's a little bit different in that when a snow day is called, the most common thing for a district to do is to add that lost day on to the end of the school year in June. And so the exams that the kids take are always at a fixed point in time in the spring. And so even though the kids have that additional day, that day comes after the exam, and so they lose that time to prepare for the exam.
So that's really what you were looking at, isn't it? Whether that lost day or couple of days along the way before the exam impacts the exam results.
Exactly. And so what I found was that there was no effect of that. I found something else, though, that was perhaps even more surprising, which is it's not the very snowy days when schools close that cause problems for student learning. It turns out it's the days when you get 4 or 5 inches of snow. The schools tend to stay open, but what happens is that you see a spike in absence rates. And it turns out those days are ones where you do see test scores at the end of the year go down if a school has a lot of those.
Like on this day in February when Mayor de Blasio got some blowback for keeping the schools open, there was only about 50% attendance. So you're talking about a day like that.
Exactly. That's a very extreme example, but those are days that are very hard for teachers to deal with because you don't know as a teacher, should you teach your lesson as you planned and then catch up the missing kids the next day? Or do you not teach your lesson and delay everything and try to get everyone back on the same page the next day? Either way, you either spend a lot of time with the kids who are absent at the cost of the rest of the class, or you don't catch up those absent kids, in which case those kids suffer. And that's tough for a teacher to deal with.
You know, when I was growing up, I lived right around the corner from my high school. So on these kinds of days, if the school was open, I tended to be there. And it was fun. And sometimes it was enriching. I mean, either half the teachers wouldn't show up either, and we would have a lot of playtime or study hall, which was the same as playtime, or we would get some very individual instruction or enrichment, educational games with the teachers, things like that. So my recollection anyway is that for me as a student, being there on those days was a pretty good thing.
Yeah, so just to be clear, we don't have anything in the data that measures fun. And so or just sort of general enrichment. We have only this straight math and reading scores, and I'm completely willing to grant that those are fairly limited measures of what students are experiencing in these classrooms.
There are other reasons, though, that the mayor and the chancellor in New York and others argue that they should often err on the side of keeping the schools open. One is that in a city with such a high poverty population among the children, that many of the kids get their main meals of the day at school. Another one is that so many parents have to work, single parents and other parents, and that the schools are really necessary to, not shut down that whole family network of having to bring in money and not burn vacation days.
Yeah, I should be very clear, though I think that, my study was answering an important question. In the grand scheme of things, when schools are making a decision about whether to close or not, I don't think test scores are at the top of anyone's list. You said it at the beginning of your program. Child safety is the big one, and then after that it's child care and whether this interferes with parents' work lives. And the fact is the test score impacts that we measure in this data are pretty small relative to the importance of those things.
So would you measure the other things? I don't know if it's quantifiable to juxtapose meals and family income against lost instructional days' impact on standardized test scores. Is there such a study that could even do that?
That would be hard. The education departments don't collect the data on what parents are doing in terms of their work lives. And so I think that would be a tricky study to do. I think the big takeaway that I get from my study actually is that people get really worked up about snow days because they're very dramatic events. But the fact is that they're actually pretty rare in the grand scheme of things, and that kids lose much more instructional time from just their regular absences, from either being sick, cutting school, whatever reason they're not there. In Massachusetts, at least, absences are 4 times the size of the days lost to snow.
In fact, we have a graphic from your research that demonstrates that. We're going to put this up right now, and maybe you can explain to everybody what we're looking at. I guess the top line, which is a fairly flat, a consistent number, has to do with regular absences, right?
That's right. That top line just says that in an average year in Massachusetts, the average Massachusetts student is absent 8 days a year. So that's 8 out of the 180 days. So that's a pretty big chunk of time. But then the bottom line, or the bottom couple of lines, are basically measuring how much snowy weather was there in each year, and how many days did the average kid in Massachusetts miss due to school closures. And that obviously bounces around a lot, but on average it's about 2. And so if you were worried about kids losing instructional time, in my mind, snow days are not the thing that you should be focused on. You should be thinking about, why are all these other absences going on? Is it the kids' health? Is it their inability to get to school because of transportation issues? Are they cutting school? Figuring those things out, I think, is pretty important.
So do you wind up with any public policy recommendations from your research?
So I actually think the big public policy recommendation that I take away is that schools and teachers need to figure out better systems for dealing with student absences. And what I mean by that is, we now have technology, and I think this is beginning to happen, where if a student is absent on a given day, they may be able to get the assignment online, for example, or somehow keep in communication with their teacher. But I think schools and teachers have to work a little bit better to figure out, how do you take a kid who missed yesterday, missed a couple of days, and catch him back up without costing the rest of the class a lot of instructional time? And that's a really tricky issue.
Well, what do you say we redo the whole groundhog thing in New York and Massachusetts and see if we can't start spring tomorrow, huh?
That would be great. It's very cold in Massachusetts right now, and I would be thrilled for spring to come.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, the Internet of Cars, auto safety networked. Recently, we looked at Mayor de Blasio's plan for traffic and pedestrian safety called Vision Zero. Central to the effort, lower speed limits, public awareness, and redesigning intersections. All good. But simultaneously, researchers and automakers around the world are working on electronic features that could make collisions far less likely as well. In fact, last month, the U.S. Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration announced that one day soon, all cars will be required to automatically communicate with each other, enabling a world with fewer crashes, less traffic, and maybe even lower energy consumption. The University of Michigan's Transportation Research Institute, or UMTRI, was behind the data that drove the DOT to make its decision, and they are now shifting their research into high gear with an elaborate new testing facility in Ann Arbor. Joining us via Skype to tell us about that and explain what an Internet of Cars might look like is UMTRI Director, Dr. Peter Sweatman. Welcome. Hello from New York.
Oh, hello to you, Brian. Hello from Ann Arbor.
What are some of the main features of this Internet of Cars?
Well, we're really starting off from the program we've been working on, which is connected vehicles, connected infrastructure. And so that's a huge platform for doing a lot of things. As you indicated in your introduction, the US DOT have made a pretty important announcement in the last few weeks that this platform has a huge future, particularly from a safety point of view, for avoiding crashes. And in fact, they've estimated that this technology could avoid 80% of serious single vehicle unimpaired crashes. So that's the biggest thing that's been around for a while. At the same time as the connectivity has been proven out here in Ann Arbor, we're seeing a movement to more automation. And we see it in aircraft, and we see it in the news every day. And of course, a number of automakers have been working on that for quite a while. So there's a tremendous amount of interest in the fact that maybe we've reached a tipping point with technology, both connected and automated, that is really going to make a huge difference to the way we think about mobility in the future.
And this is such a huge change. Smart cars, smarter than we, the people who drive them in many instances, with respect to avoiding a collision that we may be close to having, as opposed to the technology focusing on seatbelts and airbags and things designed to survive a crash. Let's show some Department of Transportation videos with some examples of this, and then you'll explain to us what we've seen. This first one has to do with a regular car dealing with an oncoming emergency vehicle. Check it out.
Emergency vehicles could use DSRC to preempt traffic signals. They can also use DSRC to broadcast their presence to drivers with an obstructed view or difficulty hearing the siren.
Caution, emergency vehicle approaching.
So we had Siri's brother there, that voice in the car, telling the driver that an emergency vehicle was approaching. How did they know?
Well, we saw two types of technology there, the same platform, but the first one was what we call V2I, vehicle to infrastructure. So the emergency vehicle was communicating with, in that case, with the intersection, with the signals, so it could get a green signal when it needed one. And in the second one, using the same platform, it was vehicle to vehicle. So the emergency vehicle was communicating with the vehicles around it. It's the same DSRC, or that stands for Dedicated Short Range Communication. And the platform is the same, as I said, and it basically means that the vehicle is communicating 10 times per second to vehicles and infrastructure features that are in the immediate vicinity. So that's why we call it short range communication. So it's really only communicating with vehicles and infrastructure features that are of immediate interest and where there might be an emerging risk that needs to be, the driver needs to be aware of. So instead of the human having to have that continuous form of attention, and we know how challenging that can be, 10 times a second, but it's more than that because we're actually knowing that, okay, this signal is coming from an emergency vehicle. There's a certificate associated with that, so we can rely on it. So that's all part of the, so they're different applications using the same platform.
Let's give another example. This is another video about the car interacting with something that's going to tell it about road conditions.
DSRC technology makes it possible to automate traffic and roadway status updates from a large number of probe vehicles over the entire local road system. More detailed and localized information can be routinely collected. Beyond just traffic movement information, a probe vehicle could also use DSRC to report dangerous road conditions such as traction loss. The control center is able to identify problems quickly as it receives and correlates a number of reports from the same location. It can then alert approaching traffic through in-vehicle or roadside messages.
All right, so that's pretty self-explanatory. I just hope all those waves emanating from everywhere don't fry our brains. But let's show one more example. And this may be the most interesting one. Vehicle hazard warnings. Check it out.
DSRC technology allows cars to inform each other of critical safety events. In this case, the white vehicle is forced to stop as the car's deceleration crosses a threshold that sends out warning messages intended for all vehicles behind it.
Warning, vehicle braking ahead.
This is especially useful for drivers with an obstructed view of the road ahead. Furthermore, cars can relay messages to extend the driver's information horizon. For example, a traffic congestion warning could be forwarded upstream, or it could be carried by opposing traffic. DSRC makes it possible for cars to actively help each other. Driving could be made safer and more comfortable.
3, 2. Well, Professor Sweatman, it all looks very helpful and all looks very advantageous. How far are you going with this? What are we headed for? Are we headed for a kind of true autopilot where the car actually drives us instead of we drive the car?
Well, the short answer is yes, but if I could quickly comment on those two examples, they were a bit different from the first one we saw because they were kind of a crowdsourcing thing going on there. So we've got a group of vehicles telling us about a winter weather condition. We've got slippery road conditions. So we're not just getting a signal from one vehicle, but we're starting to believe it when we see a number of vehicles providing a similar signal. And the second example where you have a sudden shock wave in the traffic where the traffic is stopped, again, you need a number of vehicles broadcasting. So, we call that probe data, and that's the other side of this, because it helps the highway managers to do their job so much better and cheaper. But having established and created all this platform of connectivity, what else is going on? So we're already starting to see a lot of interest in automation. The US Department of Transportation has actually identified 4 levels of automation going forward that they're expecting to see, with varying degrees of eyes off the road, feet off the pedals, hands off the wheel, and so on, and then eventually driverless vehicles. So the interesting thing about this is that the platform we've been talking about, the connected platform, sort of becomes a super sensor in that environment. So an automated vehicle does need sensors, usually vision sensors and so on, so it knows the environment around it. But it also needs this kind of connectivity to really provide some redundancy in the information that it's getting. So we're really on a path now for the connectivity and the automation to come together, and then we get to the point where we can actually spend time in our vehicles usefully. At the moment, we have this problem of distraction in vehicles, where the driver is supposed to be doing that task, that 10 times a second situation awareness all the time, and maybe isn't. And now we flip that around and we get to a point where the machine is doing that and actually driving the vehicle.
So there's another upside of this if it all works out. Not only fewer crashes, but texting and driving, hey, no problem, go ahead. But will drivers accept this? I mean, there's a feeling, I would imagine, of a loss of control. We're not in control of our vehicle if the machine and the sensors are making all the decisions about where it's going to go. Even if those machines and sensors are better and safer at driving than we are, there's certainly the feeling of loss of control. And I see that you did some research that looked into driver acceptance of this technology with over 700 drivers. So what did you find?
Well, drivers love this. They first of all, they like the safety aspect. Safety sells. Safety is top of mind. In fact, the interesting thing is that the 3,000 or so vehicles we have currently operating in Ann Arbor, many of them are being operated by parents from the Ann Arbor public school system. Why are they doing that? Because they're interested in the health and security of their kids in the future, and they understand as soon as they experience this technology, they realize just what a benefit that's going to be. So it's all about safety, but as you said earlier, there are many other benefits here, and we think Americans are going to be the first in the world that are really going to embrace the idea that they can spend their time a lot better than simply doing this monitoring task of driving. Sometimes driving can be fun, sometimes it's not, and humans are not that well suited to these kinds of monitoring tasks. So we think it's important. We're also seeing a change in the attitudes to driving. So we're seeing young people today aren't getting their licenses at the same rate that we did. And so the whole idea is that they are more interested in being connected and using their time through that connectivity rather than actually driving a vehicle.
Right,
So
which leads them to mass transit more, which is a good thing unless this technology can also cut down on carbon pollution. But let's show a graphic of a kind of experimental urban environment that I understand you're going to be testing soon. If anybody saw the movie Truman Show, think totally phony city, but in this case, with a positive social purpose. And we have this graphic up that shows some of the elements in this urban environment that you're going to construct. Can you describe to our viewers what we're seeing here?
So we're building this, we call it a fake downtown. So actually the site that we have at the University of Michigan, we're building 13 signalized intersections, miles of different lane configurations. So we've got 2, 3, 4, 5 lane highway roadway segments. We've got two aspects to it. One is to really simulate a dense urban downtown situation where you've got traffic signals, you've got buildings. So we're building facades which we can kind of move around, but they're close to the roadway. We've got pedestrian facilities. We've got various kinds of parking configurations. We've got buses. We've got roadworks. We've got a rail crossing. So all of the kind of complexities that arise in a downtown area, and of course this is the most challenging environment for an automated vehicle. So the sensors on those vehicles need to be able to recognize a fire hydrant. They need to be able to recognize a post box, a set of traffic lights, and so on.
Right, and of course all these elements that we saw in that graphic are emanating signals, so they're all wired together in some sense. One of them, I don't know if we can get the graphic back up, but one of them that struck me showed the pedestrian on the corner, and people look at the little sign there at about 11 o'clock on this screen, and it says stationary and mechanized pedestrians. What is a mechanized pedestrian?
Well, we will have some mechatronic pedestrians. So these are devices which emulate the gait of a real pedestrian, but clearly is a lot safer than using real pedestrians. So we're going to have these mechatronic other actors in the scene so that we can test these things, because what we need to be able to do, Brian, is to recreate these unexpected situations many times in exactly the same way. So that's why we need to mechanize much of this. So we're very excited about this. One of my good colleagues from California says, well, this is a Western town. So, but we call it, I guess we call it a fake downtown.
If there's a bug in the software and I get into an accident, who's liable?
Well, this is something that's going to evolve. So right now, it's absolutely clear, and it's absolutely clear with the connected technology I showed you, the driver is still responsible. As we go into this automated world, then the responsibility is going to transfer somewhat, and we're not quite sure how that's going to play out, and that's one of the important parts of research that we need to do here at the University of Michigan.
Is there a connection between these types of things and the so-called black box or event data recorder that I believe every car manufactured as of this year is required to have, that records basically every driving move, when you're braking, when your signal lights are on, if you're wearing your seatbelt, how fast you're going? Are these things related? I know there are privacy concerns with those black boxes being required, but police also want to have them so they can see who is responsible for an accident. I know there was an incident a couple of years ago where the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts got into an accident and said he was wearing a seatbelt and driving the speed limit, but the black box that his car had revealed that he was going 100 miles an hour and his seatbelt was not fastened.
Well, Brian, I think the point there is that these things, the black boxes as they're called, were really designed to help with the post-investigation of crashes. So those devices only store the most recent information and then they overwrite. So if a crash doesn't eventuate, then that data doesn't end up getting stored. So they're very different. I don't view them as being connected to or related to the technology we're talking about, because we're avoiding crashes. And in fact, with the connected technology that we have deployed at the moment, while your vehicle knows that there's other vehicles around it, and it's able to detect 10 times a second whether those vehicles are getting closer to you or further away, it doesn't know who they are. And the information is only retained for the period that those vehicles are in close proximity to you. And once the traffic scene moves on, then that information is discarded and we get new information.
All right, well, it'll be interesting to see the results of your experiments and how quickly some of these things might roll out in the real world. to use technology to help prevent accidents. Thank you so much for explaining all this.
Thank you, Brian. Pleasure.
There are differences on how to pay for pre-K in New York State right now, but nowadays it's hard to find an informed opponent of pre-kindergarten itself as central to learning and development. However, there is disagreement about whether to stick to old-fashioned books, blocks, and crayons or add electronic tablets or e-readers to the classroom. Researchers at John Carroll University in Ohio and at the Southwest Institute for Families and Children have published a series of studies on the effects of e-readers on kids who haven't yet learned their ABCs. Their latest is entitled Young Children's Engagement with E-Books at School, Does Device Matter? Joining us via Skype from Arizona, Karen Burstein, director of the Southwest Institute. Thank you for joining us. Hello from New York.
Hi, and from Arizona.
I imagine a lot of our viewers immediately are split into camps just hearing that introduction, and that the critics, the skeptics, the doubters will say, well, what's the point of introducing screens to children that young, because there's an inherent addiction risk in the first place and probably no educational benefit. That is, nothing you could do with these screens for a 3- and 4-year-old that you couldn't also accomplish with old-fashioned analog devices. So let me start with the educational question. Are there things that you think 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds can do educationally with tablet computers that they can't do without them?
Yes, in a nutshell, the tablet and the e-book device, we're finding potentiates the learning for many children and increases children's digital literacy in general.
Digital literacy could come later. One would argue there's plenty of time for that. But I know that one of the problems that parents of toddlers have is that the kids want to play with the tablets, but it doesn't mean they're reading. You know, they want to swipe and go to the next page and do all the fun motion sensor stuff that you can do with those instruments. So do there need to be certain programs that the kids are restricted to that actually in some way or another make them read before they go to the next thing? Or how do you guarantee that it's educational?
Our work has been primarily around how would we use ebooks in instructional settings to help promote early literacy. There are a lot of people that have looked at devices and how devices work effectively with children, and I think there's probably a good point for families and for teachers to be cautious and to moderate the amount of time, as well as be very vigilant around what children are using and what media, what content they're accessing.
So what are you studying? When you see kids using the tablets as e-readers, what do you see and how do you measure it?
We did a series of 4 studies, and the first of which was to look at the design of the classroom and how we would use ebooks and where ebooks would even have a place within a traditional early childhood classroom. Our later studies looked at how ebooks could be used to potentiate reading for young children, and some of the things that we looked at were the ebook's ability to shoulder some of the heavy load, such as decoding for children that can't yet read but want to hear the story and want to be able to comprehend the story from the story design. Another issue that we looked at was attention, and we all know that ebooks are novel, and we know that novelty gets us and hooks us into something. And for many children, it keeps them engaged longer at the task of reading. One of the things that we looked at, or one of our outcome measures, was the amount of vocabulary that children could learn in addition to vocabulary that was being learned other places in the classroom. And our research showed that, in fact, children did learn more vocabulary and more quickly in a more user-friendly environment using the ebook.
Let me go back to one of the things you just said, which was that attention span increased. One of the problems that parents have with kids so frequently is that their phones, their tablets, their MacBooks, everything can dissipate attention span because people constantly have split attention, that kind of thing. You're saying computers, tablets can actually be used to increase attention span?
We think so. Our data indicated, especially for children that had a tendency toward low attention, we found that they not only attended longer, but they attended more quickly to the book.
Are teachers using tablets already very much in the real world, or mostly just in the studies?
We're seeing more and more tablets across the board. We work with a lot of Head Starts across the country, and one of the things that we're seeing is that teachers are using them for multiple purposes, for their own classroom maintenance and managing information, but also using them with children. They're using them for storybook reading. They're using them for children's games. A fascinating app that we saw recently, a free app, I believe, was to teach young children indigenous language in communities where indigenous languages such as Navajo are receding. So they have these wonderful little apps that kids can hear and practice and then get auditory feedback immediately on what their own voice sounds like. Another thing that we're seeing children do is we're seeing them beginning to become early writers, because some of the things that ebooks allow are kids can write, they can draw, they can create their own little books, and then they can share them with families, and they're portable.
Do you find that ebooks accommodate different learning styles? Because I think you'll agree some kids are more tactile learners, some kids are more visual learners, some kids are more audio-oriented learners.
Actually, I think that children learn best when there are multimodalities. And I agree that some children learn better in different modalities. But what an ebook would bring would be auditory, it would bring visual, it would bring tactile. Doesn't bring olfactory, and I'm not so sure we want it to, but I think that it does afford lots of different outlets for multimedia for children.
I'm sure if you leave the tablets in with the stinky cheese, you can get the olfactory in there too.
I think
so
right.
as New York City gears up for what looks like it's going to be tens of thousands of new pre-K slots, what's your recommendation? Is this going to have to be another whole funding push after they look for the seats and the space and the teacher salaries and all of that, that you would argue for universal tablet distribution?
I don't know that I would say universal tablet distribution. I would say that every classroom could benefit from several. We put these very, very expensive big systems, these whiteboards and these very large systems, where in reality we would probably get as much bang for our buck from several smaller ones that teams of 2 or 3 children could gather around and use. They're portable. They can be used anywhere in the classroom. Given that it's no longer a question of ebooks or traditional books, but it appears that they are compatible technologies in classrooms. It would seem to be a wise decision to consider using some of both in classrooms.
Thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
According to IMS Health, the global health information provider, Wikipedia is the leading source of medical information for patients and healthcare professionals. If that's got you worried because anyone can edit Wikipedia, not just experts, we've got good news for you. A health sciences professor at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School has created a class for students entirely devoted to updating Wikipedia's most important health-related pages. He is Dr. Amin Azam, and he joins us via Skype from Oakland. And to bring us up to speed on Wikipedia's outreach to the medical community, Lane Raspberry, Wikipedian in residence at Consumer Reports and a member of Wiki Project Health. Welcome to both of you. Hi. Lane Raspberry, for the uninitiated, what is a Wikipedian in residence at Consumer Reports?
Well, first, a Wikipedian is a contributor to Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia. Anyone can edit any Wikipedia article at any time. That I'm a resident at Consumer Reports just means that I'm employed by Consumer Reports to put information onto Wikipedia.
And give me an example of when you've done that and how it's helped public knowledge.
Well, I've been at Consumer Reports for a couple of years now. Consumer Reports is a nonprofit organization. They help consumers make decisions in the marketplace, and one of the fields in which they give advice is health information. Consumer Reports gets health information from medical specialty societies in the United States. So this is the organizations that help doctors become cardiologists, urologists, publish the journals, host the conferences, these kind of things. They send health information to Consumer Reports from the medical journals, and then I, in turn, take that information and put it into Wikipedia. It's part of a health educational campaign called Choosing Wisely, in this case.
Give me one example. Got one?
Sure. So the American Academy of Family Physicians says that people who experience low back pain should not immediately seek medical treatment or think about surgery. They should wait a while, use non-medical, non-pharmaceutical interventions to treat the back pain, and just see if it subsides.
Stretch.
Yes.
Gently.
Yes.
Dr. Azam, I understand that patients, regular folks, would turn to Wikipedia a lot for medical information. But the stat that says doctors turn to Wikipedia for medical information more than any other source, that's kind of flabbergasting. I mean, this isn't exactly the tightly controlled, peer-reviewed Journal of the American Medical Association, and doctors know that, don't they?
Absolutely, doctors know that. I think the key to remember is doctors can't be experts on everything, so even doctors need a refresher course once in a while, and Wikipedia is written in a way to remind us of some of those details that we might have forgotten since we last thought about a specific disease or diagnosis if we're not active in that area, and it's written in a way for both health professionals and the broad public to understand.
And it might even be true, what you find on Wikipedia.
It doesn't surprise me at all that the medical students that I work with all go to Wikipedia first. And I can't speak to whether all doctors go to Wikipedia first and then go on to more reliable medical sources. But I certainly think the use of Wikipedia in the medical or healthcare space has been increasing and will only trend that direction as we go forward.
And I have to say that as a journalist and a talk show host, I love Wikipedia, and I use it all the time. And the information is so varied and so broad, and you know, the fact that the public is contributing to it gives it, I think, a much more well-rounded totality of information than if only experts were contributing. However, I only do use it as that first screen, as I think you were indicating some doctors do. So any information that I find on Wikipedia, before I would put it on the air, I will go try to check it from a source that doesn't have that inherent risk of being wrong. I don't know if doctors do that generally as well, but is that where your class comes in?
I think that's right. I mean, my class is designed for fourth-year med students to be contributing to the medical or health professional content in Wikipedia. In that sense, fourth-year med students are not yet doctors, but they certainly have had enough training to be close to being doctors. They're less than 6 months away from earning their MD degrees. So they have enough knowledge to improve the quality of the Wikipedia content, and they also are still close enough to not being doctors that they remember how to write it in a way that everyone can understand.
And Lane, you at Consumer Reports rank different pages of Wikipedia health information for quality, is that correct?
There is some quality ranking, but that's not something that I do with Consumer Reports. So the roles on Wikipedia, they're fulfilled by the Wikipedia community. There's not really any particular hierarchy. Anyone can serve any role at any time, but yes, there is a quality control. There are quality control processes. These are managed by the community.
Can you explain the different levels of quality?
Sure. So it depends on the subject matter, but for example, there's grades that articles can get, a grade C, a grade B, a grade A. And then there's a peer review process on Wikipedia called the good article process. In the good article process, a group of Wikipedians decide to, they're going to evaluate an article, and they're going to follow a rubric by means of which they can judge the quality of the article. They'll check to see whether the article meets the standards in the rubric, and if they can check all the boxes verifying that it meets the standards that they expect, then the article gets good article rating.
And Dr. Azam, part of what you do in the class is you find the lower rated ones and you use your students to upgrade the quality of them. Do I have that right?
Yeah, not only that, but we also specifically wanted to use the lower quality articles that were of the top importance. So the top 100 most read medically related articles on Wikipedia were the ones we wanted to work on first because they have the largest public health impact and opportunity to make the biggest difference in the world.
What are some of those, for example, that you've dealt with?
So, for example, in this first version of the class, students chose to improve the medical content on an article of, for example, cirrhosis, hepatitis, white blood cells, and alcohol withdrawal syndrome. So those are some examples that needed some improvement in the quality and were very important topics.
I believe you told my producer that you consider this the most important work you're doing. Did I get that right?
I am at heart a medical educator. I do still see patients, but I believe making the next generation of physicians is, in my case, a higher calling and it has an opportunity to make a bigger difference. These students are contributing to something that more people read than anything else the students might write. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't also write peer-reviewed articles and submit them to medical journals, but they can contribute to Wikipedia today, now, and make a bigger difference than potentially the small number of eyeballs that will read those peer-reviewed articles.
Lane, do you think there's a danger of big pharma or other big money interests monkeying with the Wikipedia pages to skew things toward having patients want to buy their products or having doctors recommend their products?
Of course, we in the Wikipedia community are very scared that this can happen, and it's happened in some other fields. We haven't seen it in pharma. So I should say that every edit on Wikipedia, it's checked by a real human, usually multiple humans. So if somebody's monkeying with any Wikipedia article, it gets detected usually within a few minutes and certainly within a day with English Wikipedia. But the way to counter this is to get more eyeballs on more Wikipedia articles. And this is why getting student participation would be great for the Wikipedia community, and we've always wanted more outreach to the
In other words, the wisdom of the crowd,
yes.
right? The more
Yes.
eyeballs on it, coming from the more perspectives and the more opportunities for expertise, the more likely it is to self-correct to be accurate.
Yes, we want diversity of opinion, and not just in English speaking. We want international voices in this as well.
So, Dr. Azam, how are the med students doing with this? Are you having success?
Oh, I couldn't be happier with the course. The med students have told me that not only was it eye-opening for them to realize that they could make a difference, but they didn't realize how hard it was actually going to be. So there was a lot of aha moments for them to realize that their emerging expertise had to be translated into the format of Wikipedia, and they had to think very carefully about what to include where, what to delete, what to reference, what order of symptoms to put things on. They've discovered that being a digital contributor to the Wikipedia space is actually much harder than being a digital consumer and merely reading it.
Lane, how do Wikipedia controversies get resolved? And particularly with respect to health, you know, the gamut from do vaccines cause autism, which just about all medical science says no, absolutely not, but there's a very vocal crowd out there that's small that believes it does, might be more inclined to participate in a forum like Wikipedia, to things that are more genuinely in dispute, like what kind of diet most reduces your risk of heart disease. So how do these kinds of conflicts and disagreements about which the different camps feel very passionately get resolved at Wikipedia?
There's different answers I could give to that. One thing that I could say is that most arguments happen between people who understand how Wikipedia works and who fail to understand how Wikipedia works. So number one, on Wikipedia, if you add information to Wikipedia, it's not supposed to come out of your own head. You're supposed to take information from a published source, summarize it, and then cite the source from which you got the information. And so if you're only dealing with good sources, no one ever gets too crazy on Wikipedia. Everything's something that's already published. Now, if there's a dispute beyond that, There's dispute resolution processes on Wikipedia, so some people are Wikipedia editors or contributors. Some people are actually mediators. They resolve arguments. So if there's an argument, people can go to one of these people and get it resolved. But in the case of the autism situation and vaccines that you mentioned, so that's a special case. There was a problem internationally in the media where this rumor was spread that some vaccines can cause serious health problems. And the problem was that this relied on primary medical research with a very small number of test subjects, and it ought not have been propagated at all, yet this went into news media. This wasn't a problem on Wikipedia because the community looked at the original resources, identified that it wasn't a source to be cited or trusted, and Wikipedia itself did not propagate that particular rumor.
Well, same question, Dr. Azam. How do you teach resolving medical controversies to your students, and how do you find they're dealing with it?
Yeah, I think that that is something we'll have to work on as we move forward. At this point, we've just demonstrated proof of concept that med students can contribute to Wikipedia for academic credit in medical school. We chose to avoid the controversial areas first to specifically not get into these editing wars, but I would offer that there is so much more room for improving high-quality medical content that isn't controversial, so we've got a ways to go. When we get to those controversial domains, I think it's valuable to have the medical students see and engage in the dialogue so they understand the full spectrum of patients they're going to see who may disagree with the medical science, and then they're going to have to address it.
Why is this worth your time and effort? Why not just sort of write off Wikipedia as an interesting and kind of useful but unreliable public sandbox and focus your educational efforts on helping these med students contribute to more controlled forums?
Yeah, I would give two answers to that. Number one, this is where the world goes for health information, as you started at the beginning of this piece. So there's no reason for the health professionals to be ignoring it as superfluous. It's actually quite important. The second reason I would offer simply is that this is where med students go first. So I think it's important to teach our med students to be thinking critically and carefully about Wikipedia, and then in the end, making it a higher quality source for open information for all the world.
Lane, how'd you get into this business? How does one become a Wikipedian for a living?
Oh gosh, it's hard to know what kind of person would be attracted to editing an encyclopedia in their free time as a volunteer. I can't really say what compelled me to do this, but I picked it up a few years ago. I actually had a few problems on the way. I edited Wikipedia. Some people told me I did it the wrong way, and so I gave it up for a couple years. I tried again 2 years later. The same thing happened. I did it the wrong way.
What does that mean, people thought you did it the wrong way?
Well, so I added some content to Wikipedia. I was citing sources which were not appropriate, news media that wasn't reliable, when I ought to be using what's called reliable sources on Wikipedia, academic sources or a book by an established authority. So I didn't get in the beginning that Wikipedia just wasn't a free-for-all anarchy. It has some rules. But once I tried again, I persisted. I edited Wikipedia. Somebody told me I did something wrong. I said, what did I do wrong? They told me. I got the rules, and I've been doing it every day for several years.
What were you doing for a living back then? I was in Seattle, right?
Yes, I was doing clinical research when I first started. Yeah, so I've been editing medical articles for some time now.
And again, it's almost the opposite, because you couldn't be in a more controlled environment than clinical research, where you have to really isolate your variables and follow very stringent rules, right?
Well, frankly, it scares a lot of people in health. The idea of putting some of their information on Wikipedia, having it open for discussion, what if the wrong ideas get out? But again, this is where people are going, and if you want to reach people where they're at on their level, I think that anyone who has health information to share ought to consider whether they ought to be putting it on Wikipedia.
And Dr. Azam, can you get copyrighted material onto Wikipedia? Is that a barrier to getting the best possible information out there for the public and for the doctors?
Well, as Lane said, these need to come from reliable sources, but part of the job of a Wikipedian is to read and digest those sources and then summarize it without copying and word for word pasting the content from copywritten material.
And Lane,
So
you do that kind of thing all day, basically, right?
It's unfortunate that there's not more sources that we can't put into Wikipedia directly, and this is because of copyright restrictions. So anything that's put into Wikipedia, the user retains their own personal copyright, but if someone hasn't released the copyright into Wikipedia, you can't copy things directly.
Good Wikipedia is like good journalism, in my opinion. It is a well-rounded article, like an encyclopedia article of any kind, that with respect to controversies, fairly lays out the arguments on the various sides, gives you the best conclusion that it can about where the predominance of evidence is, and gives you information from many points of view and ranks the sort of authoritativeness of the points of view that they're coming from. But do you see a world, Dr. Azam, where physicians, as part of their practices, in a routine way, see it as part of their responsibility to the country, to the world, to update Wikipedia, or is that too much to ask?
You know, I actually think that that is a wonderful question. I may be on the periphery of physician educators who believe that indeed that should be a professional responsibility. But if we are here to serve the world's public and our patients, then why shouldn't we be contributing to open sources where they are, improving the quality of that information?
And there we have to leave it. Thank you both very much for a fascinating discussion. And that's our program for today. You'll find a new show here each week at this hour. Next time, College for Prisoners, Preserving the New York State Pavilion from the 1964 World's Fair in Queens, another topic, and the gerrymandering of America. And tune into my radio program weekdays on WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., venture capitalist Ben Horowitz on the hard things about starting a business. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.